Hi everyone, or the 3 people watching this. I've decided to take the plunge and make a top 10 films of 2020 list. I usually watch a lot of films, and I thought I might as well mine my personal hobbies for content. The less cynical reason is that I genuinely love film and all kinds of art, and I just like talking about it, so I thought I'd just make a top 10 talking about my favourite films. So this is a personal list obviously, but there are some ground rules. I'm not an absolute madman. Firstly, this is based on UK release dates, so only films released officially in some way in 2020 in the UK. Unlike a lot of lists that are individually ranked, this is instead a list made of 3 distinct groupings, but unranked within those groups. It sounds confusing, but it'll make sense. So the first grouping is 5 great films. These are films that I thoroughly enjoyed, but for whatever reason didn't super wow me. So let's start with... The Five Bloods is veteran filmmaker Spike Lee's newest feature film. He also made a documentary about the Talking Heads in 2020, but I didn't get around to it sadly. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it feels like a perfect rebuttal to his previous feature Black Klansman, where Black Klansman was very level-headed in its approach to racial injustice and the systems set in place to attack black people, with the film ultimately saying the police are necessary and racism is down more to individuals and hate groups rather than institutions. Whereas The Five Bloods is righteously angry. The film goes in depth on the tactics of manipulation used to lure African Americans into fighting in the Vietnam War, and the multitude of ways it was actually just for white people's benefit. The film not only interrogates colonialism in America, but worldwide as well, discussing the history of French colonialism and the atrocities perpetrated against Vietnam by the French and in the Vietnam War. I admit that the film doesn't spend as much time with the Vietnamese people as maybe I would have hoped, but it helps give international context and relate the themes to a more global scale. The stylistic flourishes of mixing the documentary elements, flashback and modern scenes really works in painting a fuller picture. Also the performances are outstanding, with Chadwick Boseman and Delroy Lindo being huge standouts. I do think the film has some issues with keeping itself consistent, and it kind of forgets what its ideas are at some points, but modern Spike Lee loves incredibly messy and scattershot films, and though this has elements of that, it's far too raw and profound to ever truly lose what it's trying to say. Wolfwalkers is the newest film by the animation studio Cartoon Saloon, who has been quietly working away on some of the most stunning animated films in recent memory. This film is maybe the best that their style has ever looked, adopting the style of the storybook that the film is based on, but translating it exceptionally well into animation. The actual themes of the film and its overall story are pretty well-trodden avenues for kids' films. It's about discrimination against groups who are different, but because the main character is young and naive, they can see through these pre-established biases to truly connect with the other culture and get along. But what I will say is the film tackles these ideas in a historically interesting way, looking at the historical divide between the British and the Irish, and seeing the effects of the British invasion and their authoritarian regime had on Ireland and its people. This is incredibly relevant and works with the current tensions around Brexit and the rest of the UK's colonial ties to England. I will also say that the film has a more hopeful and in some ways radical conclusion than I was expecting, and it was really appreciated. The story is a little basic, but the black and white narrative helps in this case as the villains don't need nuance. It's a story about fighting an intrinsically hateful force, which is sadly incredibly necessary in our current climate. The edge is taken off of it by being a film for families, so anyone of any age can be radicalised against colonialism, and I just think that's neat. It's genuinely heartfelt and has gorgeous animation, so it's really hard not to love. Lynn Lucy is the debut feature of Faisal Boulifa, and is a small-scale British drama based on a true event, but follows the fictional characters of Lynn and Lucy. They are 2 friends from school, who start having issues in their relationship when Lucy has a baby and starts her own family, and the differences in the people they are and the people they want to be slowly tears them apart. The film is centred around a tragedy based on a real-life tragedy as well, but the film is deft enough that it doesn't feel exploitative or unnecessary. I really appreciate the way in which the film incorporates social media, not as an explicitly evil tool, but instead a tool built for self-image and self-preservation. Other films have done this too, but I think most of the time in a less realistic and small-scale way. The film's characters are messy and difficult to love or hate consistently, and instead you can see them as sort of heroes or villains of the story from scene to scene, but they all have their own personal motivations, and you understand their motivations well enough to understand why they think they're in the right. The film never tries to force your hand into any black or white morality, it's all in shades of grey. The fact this is Bulifa's first film and Roxanne Scrimshaw's first performance is amazing, just because it feels so naturalistic and well done on both of their parts. Scrimshaw definitely deserves the praise that she's been getting for her performance, which adds a sense of tenderness and groundedness, don't know if that's a word, to the film. I'm excited to see what they can both do later, as this is a great first start, but definitely has a couple of issues and could be improved upon with more time from both of them. Dragon Quest Our Story is an animated film adaptation of the 5th installment in the long-running JRPG franchise. Now you may ask, why the 5th one, when the 11th one just came out and the 5th one is originally from 1992, with no release in the West until its DS version from the 2000s? Well, firstly, I'd say, wow, you have a great knowledge of Dragon Quest. And secondly, there are a couple of reasons as to why they chose 5. A, because it slaps, and is genuinely regarded as the best or one of the best games in the series, and B, it thematically ties well into the story they are trying to tell. It's a film that dissects why we love stories and the power fantasy of video games, but through the lens of a popular video game that had already had a great story to begin with. Apart from genuinely capturing a sentiment I have never seen about video games, it also looks absolutely amazing. Maybe the best looking 3D animated film I've ever seen. The lighting, effects and framing work so well with the style, and really accentuate the action scenes in a way that a lot of modern animation can forget to. I know some people are very vocal about their dislike of this film, or maybe they don't get the same kind of warm nostalgia I get from its plot and story elements, but I think it is the definitive story about our relationship to video game stories, and genuinely encapsulates that pure joy and warmness better than almost any piece of media I have ever experienced. And that's an amazing feat. Uncut Gems is an insanely memorable experience, due to the hilariously funny lines, shocking moments and great cinematography, and blocking that creates such distinct visuals that live in your mind for days. If you know anything about the Safdie brothers, this is pretty much what you would expect. Claustrophobically tight shots, lots of gritty New York streets, a horrifically ever-encroaching sense of anxiety, and an absolutely outstanding main performance. One thing I really appreciated about this film more than the other films they've made is it looks at the wider context to these insane proceedings by showing the human toll of the wealth displayed, and ultimately the insignificance of the story in the grand scheme of everything. It's an interesting idea, and especially ballsy in a film that pulls you in so incredibly, just for it to almost punish you for caring so much. I do think it is maybe my least favourite of the Safdie brothers films though. I mean, they're all pretty great and I'd recommend all of them highly, but I think this one falls a little short because I do feel disconnected to some of the other players in the story. And I think a greater emphasis on them would have really hammered home some of the final moments of the film. Still, it's an incredible film, and further proof the Safdies are some of the most interesting filmmakers currently working. So now we move on to the next category. These are the 3 films that I think are amazing, which is basically to say they really wowed me, but due to minor flaws or stiff competition, didn't end up as some of my favourites. Starting with... Dick Johnson is Dead was an absolute gut punch in the middle of a tough year. A film about the inevitability of losing someone close to you, and the horrific pain of seeing that person deteriorate before your eyes. The film, in a sense, is 2 films, as it is a documentary about the making of the film that you are watching. You see the behind the scenes of the fantasy sequences and the staging of Dick's multiple deaths. The filmmakers, including director Kirsten Johnson, combine these different elements to examine life, and death in a lot of different ways, looking at regret, pain, and acceptance. The filmmakers also do an incredible job of fully using the documentary format that stylistically is often associated with cold, third-person perspectives, but instead replace that with a strong narrative and personality to get invested in. It's horrifically sad, but also imparts an incredibly hopeful message that we are all destined to die one day, and so we should love as strongly and as passionately while we still have the chance. Which not only feels incredibly necessary right now in our current hellscape, but also as just a rule for life. So this was a huge surprise, as I was just flicking through Netflix and decided to watch it on a whim. And honestly, it deserves far more discussion than it's been getting. His House is about Ball and Riel, a South Sudanese couple who have escaped their war-torn homeland to start a new life in England, but the spirits of the people they left behind still haunt them. It's a great take on the haunted house archetype that instills the story with modern and sadly still relevant themes of survivor's guilt and the horrific conditions for asylum seekers in modern Britain. The film tackles these ideas in a very interpersonal way. There's great use of visual metaphor and story structure to help develop and interweave these themes. It's an exceptionally distinct and well-crafted feature, especially as director Remy Weeks' debut. It does maybe rely a little bit too heavily on pre-established horror tropes, but almost always does so to reinterpret the language of horror cinema, to put the voices that are usually ostracised by the genre at the forefront. Horror is a genre all about the fear of the outsider and the unknown, but this film is about the fear of being the outsider and the unknown, and how society treats those people. I'm genuinely excited to see what all of these people do next, because it's just an absolutely fantastic film. Bacurau is maybe the most surprising film on the list, probably due to it being the hardest to pin down in terms of genre. It sort of morphs and changes as the film progresses, and I think the best way to experience it is knowing nothing at all. But if you're one of those people who needs some context, I'll try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible. It mainly follows Teresa, who returns home after the death of her hometown's matriarch. But when she arrives back, Teresa and the locals start to notice a lot of strange events are occurring. At first it is a little strange and hard to fully understand what it's going for, adding new layers and ideas, until the halfway mark where everything starts clicking into place. The film has a lot of ideas at play. Without spoiling, I will say there is definitely some discussion on the nature of colonialism and the Western view on other parts of the world, and I think those aspects are incredibly well done. The film is definitely blending genres, but ultimately it feels like two films smashed together, which isn't an issue as it perfectly encapsulates the perspectives and lifestyles of the two sides of the story. It really swings for the fences, and though I think there are some minor hiccups, it's extremely effective in what it sets out to do, and it's so individual and interesting it's hard to ignore. Okay, so we move on to the last section, the top 2 best. My favourite film of the year is one of these two, but because I can't decide and it depends on when you'd ask me, I just picked 2. So let's just start with... Just like every Oscar hopeful, Parasite was released in the 2 months before the Oscars. This is what usually happens, but it's annoying as after months of festival buzz and international acclaim, it gets hard to truly be excited for something that everyone has already taught to death. This is not true for Parasite though. Maybe I am biased as it was the last film I saw in the cinema, but it's amazing that Bong Joon-ho has been quietly putting out some of the best films of the last 20 years, and international markets have just decided to notice. I've been a fan of his for years, and films like Parasite are why. It's a film so good it won 4 Oscars, is highly rated on social media apps, has been talked about endlessly for months on end, and yet I still want to gush about it. Like a lot of Bong Joon-ho's work, it understands and dismantles capitalism at a very fundamental level, tearing back a system all about numbers and faceless corporations, and instead focusing on the human side, and the horrific inequality that the system has led us to. The film embraces the specific culture it was made in, with specific references and ideas relating to Korean culture, but its structure and the absolute technical mastery on display from the crew make it accessible to anyone. It has obvious themes and messaging, but is open-ended enough that there is room for nuance and distinction, which is maybe why so many people try to say it's right-wing or anti-poor, which is just absolutely insane to me. Just because your main characters are flawed doesn't mean that they are the villains. Just like The Matrix before it, this is entirely on the audience as the film adequately puts its ideas out in front of you, and dissects the desperation and talent that this household have, but the system they live in can neither give help for their weaknesses or support their strengths. Genuinely and insanely, almost flawless film that absolutely deserves every bit of praise everyone's got for it. Josephine Decker is maybe one of my favourite working directors. I didn't make a list in 2019, as I didn't really have my channel back then, but Madeline's Madeline was my favourite film of the year, and I thought Shirley would be good, but couldn't really compete to that level. But I was so wrong. Shirley is a semi-biographical film about the author Shirley Jackson, and creates a fictionalised version of her writing of the book Hangsaman. Some people take issue with the liberties taken with this version, as they probably expected a more straight-up biopic, but I think the liberties and strong stylistic elements add so much to the story. Decker has taken Shirley's life and has somehow made a film that not only encapsulates Shirley's life and work through the framing as if it was one of her stories, which is the same idea used in one of the best films of all time, Mishima: A Life in 4 Chapters, but has also heightened and improved upon her own craft. The visual metaphors, great editing tricks, layered script and foreboding nature that plays throughout, all combine to create an incredibly intricate film that has so much going on. Also, it is a vessel for maybe one of the best working actresses, Elizabeth Moss, to just absolutely own the screen. Yes, she's a weird Scientologist lady, but as an actress there are very few that can come close to her ability. Shirley is about so many things. It's about womanhood and the intrinsic dangers that women face. It's about infatuation and the strange tangling of relationships. It's about the creative process and trying to find yourself in the darkest parts of the world. And it's about finding your place and being who you want to be. This is the kind of film that excites me and makes me care about cinema as an art form, that uses language and ideas from other mediums, but conveys it in a way only possible through film. That's why I hope more people watch it, because I loved it, and I hope more people will love it as well. So that's it, that's the top 10. Remember to leave a like if you liked, and subscribe in case I ever decide to make anything else. I hope you enjoyed the video, and stay safe.